Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Retire with Style. I'm Alex Murguia, and I'm here with...
Wade Fow.
And today we're going to talk in greater detail about the 4 retirement income strategies that derive from your retirement income style here. So it's a bit of a continuation from the last episode, but we want to really get into how these play with each other. And as a quick starting point, the 4 strategies that we're aligning here are going to be discussing are total return, risk wrap, income protection, and time segmentation. If you want to know a little bit more about these strategies, the sort of primer was discussed in the last episode, so I suggest you check that out to get up to speed. And Wade, this is usually the part of normal podcast where there's a lot of small talk and chit chat between us, but we're not there yet. We're not experts at this podcast game, so we just get right to the meat of the sandwich, right, Wade?
Yeah, there's so much content to cover that we just jump right in.
So here, where we ended it last time is we were talking about there's 2 strategies that have natural correlations. And there's 2 strategies that we feel are more behavioral strategies. And we kind of give a little bit of a preview there where we discussed time segmentation being one of those behavior strategies. And we'll get that towards the middle end of this podcast. But I think it's really interesting, this idea of natural strategies. And, and I'd like to really flesh that out a bit more, Wade. Let's go into it. So if you're by natural strategy, we mean there's some natural correlations here with some of these factors. And if you're, as we discussed, there were 4 quadrants, right? But really, some of those seem to kind of fit a little better than others. Such as if you're probability based, you tend to be optionality oriented. And if you're safety first, you tend to be commitment oriented. There's this correlation, and the correlation is in the 60s, in the mid to low 60s. So the reality is that that's a high correlation, but interestingly enough, they're still capturing 2 distinct constructs. Like I said, when we did the factor analysis on them, they weren't seen as one construct. They were seen as 2 distinct constructs here. So what's kind of uncanny is that they're associated with each other, but yet they're distinct. They don't cancel each other out, which is, you see that quite a bit in terms of research. This is where accumulation distribution is that sort of secondary factor kind of is canceled out. Once you account for these 2 factors. These 2 factors, though highly correlated, though highly associated, still remain distinct. And the variation that they're explaining sort of is not canceling each other out, which I think is really, really cool from that standpoint. Wade, agree, disagree?
Right. I mean, that's getting into the heart of the matter with the fact that they're 2 distinct factors, but because they have that relationship, we still can talk about them both. And it's more natural that you see this idea of, it's the total return strategy and the income protection strategies where you see the natural correlations. That if you're total returns, you are more naturally probability-based and optionality-oriented. And those we see more frequently showing up together rather than showing up separately from one another. And then if you're income protection, you're more naturally safety first and commitment-oriented. And those, of course, are in the same way correlated with each other and become more of a natural strategy. And even going back to the past 10 years or so of the whole history of retirement income planning as a distinct field in financial planning, we do talk about 4 styles. Before there were 3 styles. It was really, they have different names, but total returns, income protection, and then time segmentation was the hybrid between the 2. We do think risk wrap deserves equal footing with time segmentation as another hybrid strategy. But really, it was always the case that these other 2 strategies, the time segmentation, the risk wrap, they didn't necessarily have those natural correlations. And that's where the motivation in discussing them was more behavioral in nature, of putting together these preferences that aren't necessarily consistent. So when we talk about something like total returns, we talk about this optionality orientation as well as probability based. And I don't know, there's a lot of interesting ways we can discuss this further, but in the world of academics, there's this idea of the annuity puzzle. It's a mystery to academic economists about why annuities are not used more. And I think this retirement income styles can actually provide an explanation why, for certain segments of the population, annuities just don't resonate. And it's because they want to keep options open. They're comfortable relying on the market, pulling from secondary factors. They maintain that accumulation mindset in retirement. They're focused on technical liquidity. They have that front-loading preference. They really want to maximize their lifestyle as much as they can today and are less worried in general about the future. And also the time-based flooring instead of perpetual flooring. So annuities do not resonate with this crowd in this total returns quadrant.
I think you're 100% right, Wade. I think, look, anyone can create. The RISA is just a framework, right? There could be another one out there. You know what? To everyone listening, have at it. Have at it. You roll up your sleeves and see what you can come up with. But from our vantage point, the RISA framework it provides a very interesting gestalt in terms of how you want to view this retirement income puzzle. We don't think it's a puzzle. We think it's not a puzzle to be solved. It is kind of what it is, from that standpoint. Because if you think about it, what are you really saying when you're income protection? You're really someone, and again we referenced it in the previous episode, but you're saying, listen, I want this floor approach. I'm going to do it by maximizing mortality credits. I'm going to optimize the risk pooling premium, if you will. Okay, works. What are you really saying when you're total return? You're effectively betting on the market premium, right? You're betting on that market premium, and if you look historically, it's hard to tell somebody you're wrong. I personally think, look, you need just because something worked previously doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. That's my own personal vibe, but I can rationally see why somebody believes this, from that perspective. And interestingly enough, Wade, I've heard you say this on occasion, and I think it fits here, because notice, it's not just probability based, it's optionality. And so many critics of the 4% rule, effectively, it's not really a straw man because it's a valid point, but they say, well, again, a 4% rule implies that you're just blindly going to effectively have the same distribution year after year adjusted for inflation, the same nominal distribution once the 4% is established, right? And so you're, in effect, I think this is the scientific term you used, you're playing chicken with the stock market, right? You're playing chicken, and that's not the case, because the people that really are in that total return camp, no one practically in their head thinks, okay, I'm going to take this amount no matter what, come hell or high water, this is the amount I'm taking until I take my last breath. That was done for an academic exercise, largely. There aren't advisors that follow anything like that to the T. So it's interesting how it's a natural fit, right? This probability-based and optionality kind of go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Wait,
because that is that accumulation mindset. Secondary factor is you're not as worried about having predictable income. And the 4% rule concept, it has many simplifications, and ultimately it's not a strategy that anyone follows directly. In this total return quadrant, you have flexible spending strategies as well, which reflect the reality of what people are doing, which is if it looks like you're going to run out of money, you cut back a little bit before that happens.
Wait, I'm stunned. It's one of these things relative to the amount of write-ups, specifically the 4%, relative to the amount of press that this gets. It's not commensurate with what's practically applied. It's just, I guess it makes a good headline, right? Oh, let me put the 4% rule. And it's always good to say the 4% rule doesn't apply anymore because, okay, someone's going to read that. Or it's now the 4%, and you're they bring you in all the time for quotes on this, but it's no longer the 4% rule. It's the 3.335% rule, right? And it just makes for good reading, or for good popular press kind of articles. But the reality is that, look, it's just some reasonable, sustainable withdrawal rate that we're taking, and we're putting it in context with my quote unquote goals for retirement, knowing full well, again, the optionality component that I realize that I will have to change if need be.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you get that optionality. Plus, again, the fact that you're not as worried about predictable income, so you do inherently maintain that flexibility. But I mean, yeah, the 4% rule, even it ignores taxes, and just the reality is, even if your spending really was constant inflation-adjusted spending, it's very hard to calibrate your taxes to also be constant inflation-adjusted taxes. So you can't use it in practice.
No, and look, I've yet to meet somebody that does. Maybe somebody does, but I have yet to meet that person. And but sustainable withdrawal strategies, beyond that are quite interesting. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we can flesh out. But you can see now, I hopefully, we've explained it, how these kind of work, right? You got these opposites. You have on one end, top right of this matrix, which is probability-based optionality. You have this total return thinking, but it's dependent on a market premium, if you will. Mm-hmm. On the bottom left, more dependent on this risk pooling premium and this contractual income vibe to it. And that just naturally appeals. It seems academics love the bottom left. Everyone else, not everyone else, but other folks are in the top right. From this natural, it's that natural yin and yang, if you will, and it's hard to say one is right, one is wrong, because they both reflect actually concordant kind of thought processes. Probability, optionality, safety first, commitment orientation. Makes sense. Mm-hmm. Very intuitive in that sense. Yeah. Now, I think... Go on. Sorry, Wade.
Well, just the total return strategy is more of based on real-world practitioner type experience. It doesn't really have an intellectual foundation in academia. The economists, economic models going back to the 1920s, really, when they solve their models, their solutions are always income protection. So that is the more academically grounded strategy. But at the same time, it's just different viewpoints. Not everyone, well, there's many assumptions that go into academic models. And so it's easy to just dispute some of those assumptions as not being appropriate. And that's where, again, we get back to two different viable strategies.
But interestingly enough, and maybe... this is the wrong word, but so be it, right? There's a rationality to this. There's an interesting flow to it that seems to work. But that's again, you're looking at the RISA matrix. That's top right, bottom left. Now, what's interesting is I think the RISA framework makes explicit what kind of has been an implicit assessment of both somebody's contextual reasoning for tilting towards a retirement income strategy and their style. Would you say that's the case, Wade?
Yeah, absolutely. And so...
Great answer. No, it's true, right? I mean, sorry I interrupted you, but think about what risk wrap is ultimately saying. Risk wrap is when you have this probability-based tilt and commitment orientation. What are you, at the higher level, what are you saying with that strategy?
With risk wrap, you're comfortable relying on the market, but there's all these other influences that make you not want to be fully dependent on the market. Whether that's you have this backloading preference, you're worried about outliving your money in a way that is more visual or visceral for you compared to someone with a front-loading preference in the top half, more like a total return. And you're comfortable committing to a strategy. You believe in technical liquidity, and those are the main issues showing up in that risk wrap world. So you want a different kind of solution then you don't want there's part of the annuity puzzle is why don't people like simple income annuities? Well, in risk wrap, you're not going to want to use a simple income annuity necessarily because you don't want to make this irreversible decision, and you still want the upside potential of the market. And that's where other solutions, other types of annuities have been designed to better meet risk wrap preferences. And it's behavioral. It's to give you a strategy that actually will work for you based on the preferences you have.
And the reason, though, Wade, I think it's behavioral is because you're taking kind of somewhat discordant thoughts here. And I'm using that term a little too rigidly here, but it's more like that than not. And what I mean by that is, okay, you want this probability orientation. You believe in this market premium, and you realize, look, over the long term, that's where you want to be. That's where the game is. At least you have that kind of accepting viewpoint. But you don't. But there's that just in case, right? There's like, I wanna play, but I don't. That kind of sense of it, and so you don't really see that a lot. And we'll talk about what the frequencies look like with regards to this. But here, if you're probability based, you're most likely going to be optionality. It's a more natural feeling. But there's a nice significant subset of folks that are probability based, but tilt down towards this commitment orientation because they want that put, if you will. It's the just in case that they can't get over.
Mm-hmm.
We could talk about, there are secondary factors that support this and the like, but that's where we're getting at. You don't see that as prevalent as optionality and probability based. These are folks that kind of take a little bit from the total return and take a little bit from the income protection and land on these structured, if you will, products that give you this market exposure but with protections.
Yeah, it's like they believe in the market. They want the exposure to the market upside, but they don't want their retirement to be completely dependent on receiving that upside. And so they ultimately are going to assume the worst, hope for the best, but assume the worst from the markets. And that becomes much more expensive in a total return context of trying to fund a retirement where you're not willing to assume much in the way of a market return. And that's where a risk wrap can define a worst case outcome for your retirement so that you can have the upside.
You're paying for that. You said expensive, but I think it's a consumption thing because you want to pay for that. It's not, it's a risk. You're paying for that risk off component.
Mm-hmm. You're wrapping that risk. You want the investment account, you want the upside potential, but you're wrapping that through insurance to have a downside protection on what the worst case scenario would be, while still giving yourself a lot of the upside. Not as much of that's the cost, is you don't have the full upside exposure anymore, but you still have a portion in different products, different ways to strike this balance. But you still have some portion of the upside exposure because you've now paid for the insurance to protect the downside risk.
And Wade, I think you've said this before, and I always found it's interesting. These are things that I think have been implicit. No one's like, we didn't discover anything. It's just one of these things that we're making more explicit, or better say, we didn't create anything; they were already there. You make a point to say that, this makes sense because over the last, 20 some odd years, you're seeing products that kind of tackle this particular subquadrant, not subquadrant, but just quadrant. Yeah. You want to talk about that a little bit? How, sure, there's markets, there's straight up stocks and bonds, total return, and there's straight up, buy a personal pension, easy peasy, kind of thing. But then you start seeing, and I think this is why you're using the word hybrid, you start seeing these products or solutions, however you want to refer to them, you start seeing these things sort of surface up to really accommodate for what's been implicitly acknowledged.
Yeah, and it's really been just since the 1990s that there have been financial tools that accommodate the risk wrap style. And it was the actuaries and insurance companies recognized people didn't like the irreversible commitment and the lack of upside potential inherent with a simple income annuity. And so how could we design some product that can provide a lifetime income protection, but without sacrificing the liquidity of the underlying asset as well as the growth potential of the underlying asset. And so to the extent that people don't like making the irreversible decision to annuitize a contract, they add these lifetime income protections, guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefits to some sort of a deferred annuity that gives them the lifetime spending protections while also providing them the technical, not true liquidity, but the technical liquidity for the asset and the upside potential for the asset. And it's just been since the 1990s that these have existed. So it's where risk wrap is a hybrid strategy, a behavioral strategy. And naturally, the financial services world develop solutions to fit the types of behavioral preferences of those individuals.
No, you're right on. Then from that vantage point, on the other side, and we spoke about this, we started previewing this in the last one, the next sort of hybrid strategy, and again, there's that anchor, total return, income protection. You take certain parts of each, you come up with risk wrap. But let's say you take different parts, you still combine them, but you take different parts of each, and you come up with time segmentation. Because what are you really saying here with time segmentation? In my view, you're saying, I want the safety of contractual income. Heck, even if you keep things in cash, in a CD, that's a contractual sort of obligation that you have with the bank. I mean, it could be a really short-term ladder that they're doing for you, but effectively, it's, you still have that contractual income. But you're saying to yourself, but I don't want it all the time, right? I want the contractual income, but not all the time. And that's tough to do, right? Contracts sort of imply this longer-term commitment, but you're kind of saying all of a sudden, I want the liabilities of my essential expenses on your balance sheet, and I'm gonna take them as needed, but I want them on my terms. I don't want them over the long term. I want to be able to call when, in a major way, because over the long term, I still kind of believe in this regression to an unknown mean, if you will. And by that I mean that you're going to need to replenish these shorter term buckets, and you aim to replenish them with, market, and you're betting kind of a little bit still on this time diversification to come through and save the day. And that's it's not wrong, but if you really think about it, this optionality and safety first is not as smooth as safety first and commitment orientation. Wade?
Yeah, and so it is a hybrid strategy as well. And time segmentation really has just developed since the 1980s. There's a few different, and it's also from the practitioner world. It's not a traditional academic approach, but you have in the 1980s different people noting this controversial idea of time diversification, which is simply this idea of stocks for the long run, that if you hold on to stocks and can leave them alone for X number of years, you feel more confident that you'll get a positive performance, that stocks will outperform bonds. And in time segmentation, most practitioners of it really have a strong belief in time diversification, that you, by having those short-term buckets, you're giving yourself a runway to benefit and to not have to lock in losses and to not realize sequence of returns risk, and to have an outcome that's, well, some people argue a better way to invest, but other people just simply say a comparable way to invest, but a way that gives people more confidence that they can understand why they have the asset allocation they have, which is bonds covering expenses, stocks providing growth for the long term.
And there are nuances around this. I mean, the reality is that even how do you decide to, excuse me, how do you decide to replenish these buckets? Let's say you're doing this over 3-year periods, and every year a small bucket sort of is used up. Do you sort of in that year replenish it, or do you wait till the final year 3? There's many ins and outs, about how to handle this, but ultimately the fact remains is that you're still kind of betting on time diversification. So, and if you think about the matrix, there's sure you're in that safety first quadrant, but there's everything's on a spectrum, right? There are still echoes of this betting on the probability that over the longer term the market will go up. You're just not dependent on it on a shorter term perspective.
And with time segmentation, if you just ask 1,000 different practitioners of it how it works, you will get 1,000 different answers. So sometimes they haven't really thought through that issue of how do you sell from the growth portfolio to prolong the short-term buckets. And if they haven't thought through that carefully, they might run into some troubles with it. But the more thoughtful versions of time segmentation definitely have accommodated for how do you replenish your short-term buckets from your long-term buckets.
Yeah. And, well, we'll get to this when we really talk about time segmentation, like which one is better or what do they do relative to the others. But again, and this is where I would say I personally don't subscribe to time segmentation myself. I'm speak for Wade. I know he doesn't either, but we're willing to acknowledge wholeheartedly that this is a viable strategy for many folks. Mm-hmm. Wade?
Right. It's time segmentation really depends on that idea of time diversification. And it definitely exists in the data that if over longer holding periods, stocks are less likely to have a bad performance. But I somehow can't bring myself to stake my retirement outcome on time diversification. And that's why personally it doesn't resonate with me. But it resonates with other people, and that's fine. It's one of the viable retirement strategies.
Yeah, and so the good news is, at the end of the day, I don't think it was intentional. I think markets work, right? And so you come up with these solutions. And so where we land on this is that, look, there are clearly different preferences for how folks want to source retirement income. I don't, if you can see the data and it's just there, right? But interestingly enough, the good news is that the financial industry has developed strategies to effectively accommodate everyone, which I think is fantastic. I really do, because this idea of empowering the individual investor, I think the first step to that really is finding out where they're coming from. How do they want to source retirement income? And the reality is that you can accommodate, those strategies. Do you agree or disagree, Wade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, any of the styles can be accommodated, and that's where there's. Once I looked at just what are different retirement strategies that have been offered, and at that time counted 37 either software packages or books or something that promoted a specific retirement strategy. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's just a matter of degree, or they all sort of fit into one of these broader styles, whether it's time segmentation, total return, income protection, or risk wrap.
Now, what's interesting now is how do people, if we go on, and this is where, with Alliance for Lifetime Income, they sponsored a national study for us, and we were able to look specifically for folks that are, 50s all the way up to, what was it, 80s or something like that, right there at the cutoff, where they are, where do they land on this, from that standpoint. And why did we start at 50? We really wanted to look at folks in which entering retirement, it was beginning to be the salient concern. Okay, I'm getting there. It's one thing to ask, how you feel about heights, from the comfort of a one-story house. It's another thing to ask somebody how they feel about heights as they're just, near some sort of precipice, if you will. And so when we look at this national study, we found something actually I thought was very interesting, and that was that consistently there's this distribution of 35% of the folks are income protection, 35% of the folks are total return, and the rest, the remaining 30% is split between 15% risk wrap and 15% time segmentation. And so that really fits nicely with what you would expect, actually. If you can make the case that, I can totally see why there's this concordance between optionality probability. I can see the same thing being said about safety first and commitment orientation. Makes sense. And that's where most of the people are, right? In those two categories. And then, to support that sort of behavior argument, okay, this is where there's kind of, there's competing is too strong a word, but there's these two styles that don't blend naturally, if you will. They're meant to accommodate. And here, risk wrap, we just discussed it, why they're somewhat not as smooth, the ideas that you have, and time segmentation. And you see this pretty consistently. And wait, what was your reaction, just on a personal level, when you saw, hey, look how people are falling in the RISA Matrix?
Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily what I would have guessed, but yeah, it was really fascinating to see that, and then to start to recognize that 35% of people are total returns, but so much of the consumer media seems to be like total returns is innocent until proven guilty, or that it's the default strategy, and anyone who's trying to say one of the other styles is viable, really they have to overcome a significant hurdle, because it's everyone's default should be total returns. So it's really interesting that we then see really only about a third of the population really is resonating with total returns as
for essential expenses.
For essential expenses. Yeah. Any strategy includes investments for discretionary and so forth. But for the pure essential spending, if you have a gap after Social Security and any other pension you may have, how do you fill that gap? And the 4% rule tells you fill it with an investment portfolio of 50 to 75% stocks. And that's only resonating with about a third of the population.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating. I think you start the whole premise of what we're here talking about is retire with style, right? You start with how you want to source retirement income according to your personal preferences. There's a strategy out there for you that can accommodate that. But interestingly enough, for whatever reason, we get the sense that everyone thinks, no, the starting point is always this investment portfolio because blah, 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 right? And it makes a lot of sense and so forth. And that's where you should start. Not starting there is a mistake. And that's just not the case. In fact, interestingly enough, it seems like things are coming full circle where you can make the case, let's say 20 years ago, folks were saying, hey, annuities are sold, not bought, that kind of vibe. Well, I think you can make the argument right now that total returns as a strategy through model portfolios are sold, not bought. Simply because I think a significantly greater proportion than 35% of the folks are in that strategy. And don't get me wrong, I think it's a completely viable approach. I have no issues with it on an academic, analytical level. But I do think, it's like saying we have any coat you want as long as it's green, kind of thing. I have nothing wrong with a green coat, but not everyone wants a green coat, kind of vibe. Wade?
Yeah, and so that's really where we're at in terms of, we are agnostic, but because we're agnostic, advocates of particular strategies will accuse us of bias. And so I don't know, where is the true bias? Is if you're telling everyone they should be in a strategy that only resonates with a third of people, are we the ones who are biased to point out you may not really be offering the best solution for everyone? Or maybe are they the ones who are biased because they are so adamant about this idea that in the case of total returns, market risk will pay off and you don't need anything else. It's not clear that it's just going to work for everyone in a way that they can.
And if you think about it, Wade, and well, let me take one little step back for our audience. We probably have a fair share of professionals and consumers listening to this podcast. And so, maybe maybe we start making a statement for advisors, or 30 seconds later we make a statement that may apply to a consumer. If we do, sorry, just work with us here, from that vantage point. But I think you're right on many levels, and part of it is right now the only issue we have with total return is not from a credibility standpoint or from an analytical standpoint. It's rather from a, hey guys, this isn't the only strategy. There are others, and just be aware of that. That's really what we're getting at with here.
And there are others that are viable, not just
Yeah, and there are
others.
others that are viable. In fact, if you look at now from a professional setting, I mean, there's a huge movement right now. I mean, Eric Clark says this a lot, and he's in the profession with regards to one of the luminaries in the investment management profession, and he gets at it, and I agree with him. The investment issue, the investment problem, has already been solved, and what we're working on is really the behavioral aspects of it. Now, when you look at it within the total return construct, I see that 100%. Because if folks have been misaligned and been led to a total return strategy when that's not what they resonate with, then I can see them having issues maintaining that strategy, especially during periods of market turmoil. And so then the value all of a sudden becomes, hey, let me walk them through this volatility, because this too shall pass kind of vibe, and we'll get through this together. My comment to that would be that's fine and dandy, but maybe they shouldn't have been in that strategy to begin with, because that's not what they resonate with. Wade?
Yeah, and that's a danger, that if you accept a style that doesn't resonate with you, that you then make changes to it at inappropriate times. And so,
Yeah.
indeed, part of that behavioral coaching might be misguided in the sense that it's trying to coach people to stick with a style that doesn't resonate, rather than trying to find a style that does resonate.
Yeah, and this goes both ways. This could be the person that was sold an annuity when he didn't need to be risk off. He didn't need it. He didn't want to source retirement income that way. So it goes both ways, 100%.
Oh yeah.
Now, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so much of the consumer media is driven towards total returns as a starting point. But these same critiques can apply to any style. Whenever somebody is sold into a style that's not appropriate for them, we hope to do what we can to help fix this issue in the future.
And part of this is to show folks that individuals have significantly more say in how they want to source retirement income than I think they realize, and this really reinforces that. And there's nothing wrong with going to a professional and saying, "Listen, this is my style. This is how I want to begin to look at sourcing retirement income." Obviously, you run the numbers and you do the plan and see where you land, but this should be the starting point, not just the chance outcome of you walk into a door and the advisor happens to subscribe to a certain philosophy. And the same thing with reading. You can be a do-it-yourselfer, and you choose to read certain things. If you're a boglehead, the world of total return awaits you. But if you're beginning to learn about things and you just happen to get on those forums, you're going to think that's the only world that's out there. And that's not necessarily the case. And so I think it's incumbent upon the individual to realize that. Now, something that I want to stress with regards to this, because I think it's cool, this 35, 35, 15, and 15 distribution, you see that across different age cohorts. You see that across whether you're pre-retirement or post-retirement. So there's this consistency of style that, because you can say to yourself, what if you switch? What if all of a sudden I'm this and that, that kind of thing. Well, interestingly, we didn't see that. Other than following one person for 30 years and doing that 10,000 times, it's hard to answer that question. But if you look at different age cohorts, 50-year-olds, 50 to 55, 55 to 60, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you see a consistency in style. You see, you can look at it continual data, you can look at it in just segments. And interestingly, you see the same thing with retirement status. It's the same consistent. It's not quite 35, 35. Sometimes it's 36, 37, 14, and 16. That kind of thing. But we don't want to give a false sense of precision. For the most part, there are those statistical differences between these groups. You don't see it between pre and post retirement. All of a sudden, in pre-retirement, you thought you were going to be total return. You retired. Hey, guess what? I'm going to be now income protection. You don't see these group differences, and that implies that these are pretty stable profiles in terms of your retirement income style. Because if you really think about it, you're asking these personality trait questions. As we discussed in the previous episodes when we talked about probability-based and safety first and optionality and commitment orientation, you want to get it, are you asking about states or are you asking about traits? And again, That's the underlying. That's how we come up with the matrix. So it's very important to look at these factors, right? And state again is I'm in a state of anger. I'm in a state of excitement. Those things. If you're listening to this podcast, I may be in a state of boredom, right? But those things, stick with us. But those things, they dissipate. You move on from that. A trait is more evergreen, if you will. It's I'm an introvert. I'm an extrovert. Yeah, maybe there's differences. I'm an introvert in class, but in a party, I'm an extrovert. But I think you folks get where I'm going with this. It's more trait-like. It's more consistent, if you will. Now, interestingly, so that's if you're following someone, that's answering the question, do I change over time? Data doesn't show that, is the best way we can answer that right now. But another thing to ask is, hey, but are there group differences just in general? Are there group differences? And yeah, they are. When you're higher net worth, you kind of see, instead of 35, 35, 15, and 15, that 35 and 35 between total return and income protection, it goes to 50% total return, and the difference goes to income protection. So, those with higher net worths, there's a little bit of a split there. Those with lower net worth, actually, the 50% flips, and it goes to this income protection. And so how we read that is there's somewhat of a, I'm going to mispronounce this, Wade, so please help me here. Endogeneity.
Endogeneity.
Issue. Yeah, there you go. Endogeneity issue. I was reading it syllable by syllable, and I was screwing it up.
What came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, which came first, right? Think about it. How do you develop a higher net worth? You take risk, and you do that professionally. And once you have that higher net worth, you can begin to self-insure a little bit more so than not. Wade, you want to maybe comment on that a little bit?
Well, it's just, if you have a higher net worth, it may just reflect the fact that it's not everyone who takes on risk is going to be successful, but those who were successful probably did take on more risk. And so there's just maybe more of a natural tendency for higher net worth individuals to have an underlying trait of being a total return thinker.
They took the probability and optionality risk on their human capital potential.
And in some cases it pays off, and that's how we identify people with higher net worth.
Yeah. Now there are differences with gender. Frankly, men tend to be slightly more, not to 50%, as opposed to 35 split, it's like 40 split. It's statistically different, but it's still the rest of these are all these in the same neighborhood. Men tend to be more total return oriented than women. Women tend to reflect a little bit more income protection and slightly more time segmentation than its counterpart, risk wrap. So you kind of see that, and it makes sense. And there's many reasons you can give it. If you ask me, on the fly, what is your reason? I would say I think life expectancy has something to play with this. What are your thoughts, Wade? Why would men, and there's a general men are more confident in terms of their ability to garner outsized market returns than women. I think you've seen that over many studies, but I think those factors play into why you see a slight differences there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And otherwise it may just be some behavioral, biological explanation about whether testosterone leads to more risk-taking. Or I don't know. I think there's some literature in that sort of
our
area.
Study, they didn't let us do the blood draw. But we'll see. We're applying for an NIH grant to try to take this to that next level, man. and relationship status. Unmarried folks tend to be more income protection, time segmentation, and married folks tend to be slightly more in that. Actually, no. Married folks tend to reflect the aggregate distribution just the same. So it's really more if you're single, you kind of tilt towards a little bit more income protection and time segmentation. You're really going to the left on that safety first side of the quadrants, if you will. So it was just kind of interesting to see. But like I said, you really when you break it down by all these things, that 35, 15 is still generally the frequency that you see. And you see that again across age groups, and at least the ones we studied, and you see that across retirement status. And again, we kind of talked to this, when we were going through the strategies and frequencies, but the larger implication to us is for 65% of the folks that are nearing retirement, they're really resonating with retirement solutions for their essential expenses that have some sort of contractual income component to them. And I would say beyond Social Security. Everyone gets Social Security, so you can kind of control for that in the question. I would say beyond Social Security. And I do think we're kind of oversold these model portfolios that can be turned into this total return approach. And then, and it's being framed, I would say, even in commercials, like, this is your kind of steady retirement paycheck. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, Wade, you said this before. You see all of these kind of retirement paycheck sort of commercials, but at the end of the day, what's the punchline?
One ad really drove the point home to me. It's for one of these robo-advisor type places, but they talk about, there's all these new risks in retirement, the longevity, the sequence of returns, and so on and so on. And then what's the solution? We give you a total return strategy. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, which don't address those risks. I mean, yeah, it's like saying, hey, there's all these new risks, but don't worry about it. We've got a strategy that ignores them. Exactly. It's like, thank you. But there it is, right? But again, even then, we would say there's many credible strategies. We're not poo-pooing total return. It's more, we just think they're overrepresented relative to what we're seeing. That's ultimately what we're getting at. But there are many credible strategies, but we think the data is just pretty clear that people have distinct preferences, and those preferences signal certain approaches. And right now, if Wade and I were to get on a soapbox for anything, is that individuals need the right tools to make these right decisions on how to identify strategies that resonate with them. And that's where we really are. That's what we're about, and we really want to stress that. And frankly, all these episodes up until now have kind of been leading to this punchline, if you will. Wait.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up. We're running a little long here, but we definitely will have more coming your way in terms of what are the next steps with the conversation, Alex. We're going to get into some of that, comparing the RISA to traditional like risk tolerance measures and so forth.
Yeah, I think if you ask me why these things are why the representation of what's being practiced isn't that 35-15-15, I think it has something to do with there's an agency issue at play. I think so. That's just our thoughts around that. But we'll also get into loss aversion and how that potentially plays a role into this. And, does that work in developing a retirement income strategy based on your personal preferences? We want to look at the RISA with regards to loss aversion and maybe, bring up some agency issues, why perhaps not everyone's getting the full spectrum of what's available to them from a retirement income perspective. Wait, this was a longer one. We're 48 minutes in. So thank you, everyone. I'll say my goodbyes, and as always, Wade, take us home.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great week, everyone. Catch you next time.
Bye.